Welcome to the podcast. This episode I've got with me Eli Appleby-Donald. She's chatting to me about the history of women in brewing through the ages. It's a wonderful chat about ancient goddesses and sacred recipes and how the role of women in brewing changed so radically and how it all compares to what's going on today. I met Eli at Summerhall pub and it might not have been the best choice actually, because it was a sunny day and it was a busy beer garden and it's an old creaky building with creaky floorboards and doors that slam and so on. So if you hear something like that in the background, just forgive us. Apart from that, I hope you enjoyed the chat as much as I did. Eli really knows her stuff and I can't thank her enough. So here's Eli.
I can't actually remember why I suddenly started looking up or researching women in brewing. I can't actually remember what made me think of that. It must have been one of those, when you get first into brewing and you become a culture vulture and suddenly you have every book and every magazine and you're on all the websites and all the forums. Something somewhere must have come up with this term brewster that got my attention, but I cannot for the life of me remember.
Well, you're a woman and you're into brewing.
So something somewhere I got excited about that, and it's not been excited enough to put in my memory.
Right.
So somewhere along I started looking at all this stuff, but the only thing I can think is I remember at some point seeing an Ninkasi award for brewing, and I didn't quite understand what it was about, because it's not just as simple as the best beer gets a medal. It's the best brewer, or the brewer that gets the most points, the most medals, is like the ultimate brewer type award. And through looking up, trying to understand how that worked and what it meant, I found who Ninkasi was. And Ninkasi is the oldest historically recorded female brewer. She's from ancient Sumeria. So way back, the records that we actually have, we go back to about 3,500 BCE, before the Common Era. But they say that the whole brewing in that time period, they can take it back to about 5,000. But she was actually, she's a goddess, but she's the woman, the female figure that at the time they all looked upon to make the magic of fermentation happen. So she was actually the goddess of beer, the goddess of brewing. But in that time in Sumeria as well, it wasn't just that they had a female kind of god of this stuff. It was the fact that the women were the brewers, and this is actually recorded in history. The women were both the brewers of the everyday beer, but they were also the priestesses for Ninkasi as well, and they believed that Ninkasi was the brewer for the gods. So she was not only god of brewing, but she brewed the beer that other gods drank. So how cool is that? You can imagine that in the whole Valhalla situation. So it's quite cool, but they have all this kind of historical records. Like they have, it's called in cuneiform, the language they used then. It's before hieroglyphs and everything, and it's almost a bit like what we would call runes. It's that very boxy square thing. And they found all these ancient tablets, and they have all these ancient beer recipes. I mean, not beer like we would recognise it today, but they have all this really amazing historical fact of what was going on. And it was the women then that were brewing it for their house rooms. Written down, yeah. It's this stuff.
All these big and dashes.
Yeah, the proper big slate tablets, and somebody got a hammer and chisel type thing. It's all this.
Wow.
And they have something as well that is on record. It's called the Hymn to Ninkasi, and it's a whole big poem, and it does two things. It talks about Ninkasi and how fabulous she was. Because her name actually meant, I think it's something like the woman who fills the mouth with liquid or something like that.
Good.
But this whole hymn is about her and how fabulous she is and what she does and how amazing it is. But it also is the first recorded beer recipe, where it talks about how she's using the Bapir malt. And back then the Bapir was like a kind of watery bread dough they made.
Right.
Out of the kind of grains and things, and that was what they then used. They malted that and then used it to ferment and make their wort. So it talks about her, how she's baking the Bapir malt on her shovel and all this. That's really, really cool, and how she then ferments it. So it's a proper kind of structure, break by break, of this goddess making her beer. And it says at the end, that this is the equivalent of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers coming together, because of course these were the two rivers that joined and made this massive green belt in North Africa, which apart from that was this really desert region. So this is quite an important kind of place where you can grow things and it's quite lush, and they likened her beer to this place where the rivers came together, so it's quite cool.
That is cool.
Yeah. But they also mean this ancient Sumeria, and it's Babylonia, it's what we now call Iran and Iraq and stuff, and Egypt, all these places were all kind of together, and Sumeria passed on the brewing to these other lands.
Right.
So you then get it appearing everywhere else, and the thing that appears in all of it is that it's the women that are brewing. And I've got this fantastic quote. I mean, I work with academics, I work in academia, and it's quite a dry kind of place to be, but I've got this fantastic quote. This guy's really quite famous. It's Dr. Patrick McGovern, and he's from the University of Pennsylvania, and his specialism is all these ancient fermented beverages.
Right.
And we're talking proper ancient. This is the guy that was doing all the work on all these tablets and what have you. Yeah, he's known as the Indiana Jones of ancient ales and wines. He's the guy you like Dogfish Head created, or he's the guy that goes in and gets these old ancient bits of clay and then uses all these fancy machines to work out what the ingredients were that were in the liquid that was in it.
Wow.
So he helps them then recreate these ancient recipes. So he said, this is brilliant, all of this, while men were out hunting, women were out gathering the ingredients they needed to make other foods and drinks to go with the woolly mammoth or mastodon. I just thought that's, given how dry academia can be, I just thought this guy's he's a proper beerhead that just happens to have fallen into it as a job. So I loved that. I thought it was really cool.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. But yeah, so she was, back then, the brewers then, we called them brewsters, or we called them brewsters, which was kind of the term for the brewers. It was a female term for it, but they called them sabtiem, which sabtiem was kind of like a real secret term as well, but the brewers, they were the priestesses, that kind of thing. But they did something else that was really cool. They made all these different beers, and that's the thing as well, is it's not just this one beer, because we think it being ancient or a bit old-fashioned, a bit not quite as advanced as them, but they had loads of different types of beers. They had, I've got a list of them here if I can find them. It was like brown beers and red beers and iron beers and all sorts of stuff, loads and loads of them, and sacred beers and household beers, and all these different types and styles. A bit like the craft industry's done now. We don't just drink bitter anymore, we've got all this other stuff, and we've changed and tweaked things. But one of the cool things they did as well is they invented the drinking straw.
Right.
Because of beer, they invented the drinking straw.
Wow.
Because back then the beers they made were quite primitive. They had all these different recipes, but they didn't have all the filtration and things that we do now. Basically, a lot of the malt products and the grains and things were still in the beer and the end product.
Right, okay.
So all this scum would be on the top. So they invented the drinking straw, and it was usually silver or gold, to pierce through that and get to the nice clear beer that was underneath.
Right, okay.
And I was saying about how they passed all these skills on to other lands. There are hieroglyphs in Egypt of Egyptian women brewing and drinking beer with these straws.
Brilliant.
It was really cool. Yeah, there's actually proper hieroglyphs, like in pyramids and things, showing that this happens. So we're talking here, we're saying there's the tablets with the recipes and the hymns. There's ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and there's also tablets. It's the oldest law book that is in existence that we have. And it's code, now I'll get the name wrong because it's a foreign word. Right. The Code of Hammurabi, I think it's pronounced. It's from about 1700 BCE, and this is how important women brewers were to them then, that their industry was written into the law of the land. And it said basically if their brewers shortchanged their customers in any way, gave them a short measure, they would be thrown in the river.
Right.
So it's like, part of you might think that's a bit harsh, that the beer drinkers in us might go, yeah, rightly so.
Yes.
But the actual law says, and the other thing they do as well is when they sold the brews on, they didn't take cash for it, they weren't allowed to take cash, they received the raw ingredients to make more beer.
Perfect.
So if you got a pint of beer from them, you get a pint of barley in return. So the law actually says if a beer seller do not receive barley as the price of beer, but if she receive money or make the beer measure smaller than the barley measure received, the judges shall throw the brewster into the water.
Brilliant.
And I thought it's recording in this ancient law book that the brew is she, female. There's no him, her, either or. It's a woman. Yes. It's a woman that's brewing this and selling this. And I thought it made me kind of smile a bit, because it's a bit like today. How many of us brew beer just for our mates in return for, if you buy the ingredients,
yes,
or you buy the bottles, So it's quite cool. It's kind of that link to modern day home brewing as well. But I thought that was really, really cool.
That's brilliant.
But yeah, but I was saying about how the ancient Sumerians had Ninkasi. The Egyptians had a goddess of beer as well, and she was called Tenenet. She was in the law as well, not just the law. There was loads of text from the Ptolemaic period, kind of around the Cleopatra time, talking about this. But also she's featured in the Book of the Dead. Do you know what the Book of the Dead is?
Right.
The Necronomicon.
Sounds.
If you were a geek teenager in the kind of 80s, 90s, this was a big deal because all the horror movies had it in it.
All right, okay.
But the Book of the Dead was a big kind of religious book of the time in Egypt, and it features this goddess in there quite a lot. And again, it's the whole thing that they say then, which is just such a fun thing to think about, is these Egyptian women were the brewers, and I was saying about the hieroglyphs. But one of the things they had was the area in the home that they brewed was called the pure.
Nice.
And men weren't allowed to enter it because it would spoil the beer.
With the germs in there.
Yeah, so from now on we need to make a point of saying that all you breweries out there, you have to get the men out of there. So that's one of the things. And what happened was beer was part of the salary that was paid to all the workers that were kind of, the city workers building all the different bits and bobs, the craftsmen and stuff. Part of the pay was beer. But as this, you've seen the historical stuff about how Egypt took off and they started building all these pyramids and statues and monoliths and things. So the amount of beer they were having to brew to pay all these workers really took off.
Of course.
So they had to commercialise it, and the little women in their kitchen pures couldn't keep up with it anymore. And as happens when you commercialise something and there becomes money involved, suddenly the men take over. So this started to happen, and the women were becoming kind of in lower roles in the kind of brewing process. But one of the things that I really love that I think is so cool, I mentioned about Cleopatra.
Yeah.
Do you know she was the last kind of big pharaoh of her time? After her time the pharaohs died out in Egypt. But they think one of the reasons that both Cleopatra and the whole Egyptian empires died out, not because of the wars that she was holding that were really unpopular, but it was because she taxed the beer to pay for the wars.
Right.
And the historians actually think it was the fact that she taxed the beers that was so unpopular that was both her and the Egyptian downfall. It was Egypt, you're taxing my beer, I'll vote for someone else.
I'm moving away.
How crazy is that? So yes, it's all
I get it.
Yeah, so it's quite cool. So we've got all these ancient records that the women were actually the brewers of the time. This was judged the way it was.
Yes.
And it's quite a cool thing to look back on that.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And it's also quite a funny thing that we have all these amazing, really kind of like literally in stone records of this going on. When you come a little bit closer through time, it gets a little bit muddier. You don't have so much of it. It's more little bits here and there and more word of mouth and words that were used and things rather than having these totally written down things. So you come forward a little bit and you get to see the Vikings. And as they say about the Vikings, did the whole rampage around the whole world, apparently in a frenzy of beer. Although historians now will say we don't think the Vikings actually did this whole berserking around the world the way we think. Maybe we think they were farmers and traders with a little bit of the kind of rampaging thrown in.
Okay.
Either way, apparently they were on the beer. But one of the cool things is in Norse law, again it's in law, women of that time, they weren't allowed to own anything, they weren't kind of prominent citizens, they were a bit second class, but the Norse law actually said that brewing kit belongs to the women and the women only.
Right.
The woman, even if her and her husband split, she would take the brewing kit away with her. That was her thing.
Right.
So
that's clearly her role in the house.
clearly again, we've got this quite definite role of the woman as the brewer. But another really cool thing is going back to the whole Viking, because Vikings weren't just Sweden, it was Sweden and Norway and Denmark and everything. But in ancient Finnish mythology, the story is that beer was created by 3 women trying to make a wedding feast. And one of them, this sounds disgusting, one of them mixed bear saliva with honey, and that's how we got ale.
I don't know about that.
No, I don't know either. The only thing I can think of is there's a lot of historic references to beer of the time smelling like a billy goat.
Right.
So I can only think the smell made them think that this is where it came from.
Okay.
Yeah, but they also, in the ancient Finnish kind of like mythologies and stories of creation, the whole thing on creation in that story, the story of how beer was created is given twice as much space as the story of how the world was created. So I think that just shows you how important the whole creation of beer was.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's something that's considered important since when you started talking about, which was like 4000 BC or something like that, to throughout the ages. So I could see why that would be an important part in anybody's history.
I suppose to us it's easy for us to understand how important beer might be, because we know closer to time, go back to kind of Dark Ages, Medieval Ages, whatever, we know that the water was really nasty.
Yes.
They had no way of purifying water, they just drank the dirty water, and it was really unhealthy. So we know they drank beer instead of the water, so it was the liquid, but it was also a nutritious, kind of, not quite a food, but for a time when people were really poor and struggling, it was a way of them getting a daily calorie count as well. So again, with the women brewing the beer, it was very much the task of the women. It was part of the feeding your family. You were creating the drinking, liquids that everyone drank. It wasn't like the beer we drink today. We're not talking 8% milk stouts or anything.
Yes,
it was very, very weak. Probably very, very sweet, not like we have now. It was just the substance that was created for the home as part of the food and drink of the home.
So like a mix between beer and Ovaltine or something?
Yeah, quite possibly. Because we go quite far back, they hadn't discovered hops yet.
Yes.
So one of the other things was they were brewing it every day because this stuff wouldn't keep.
Yes.
They couldn't put it aside for another day type thing. So one of the things that used to happen was that the women, they couldn't go out and get a job, they couldn't go out and get an education or whatever, but one of the things they could do to help their family was, if they had brewed too much beer, they could sell a little bit of it on, and then it was some sort of income for the family. So there were kind of a couple of things that happened with that. One was a way that you let your neighbours and people know that there was fresh beer to be bought, was they did something called an ale stave, which was essentially like a big pole with twigs on it, like a big broomstick outside the house, over the door, to let people know there was fresh beer. And this actually appears all over the world. At a time when people weren't connected, there wasn't really a lot of travel going. So we know here we call it an ale stave, and it was this kind of broomstick-like thing. In the Amazonian forests, they did this, and they hung flowers and garlands and things on it. The idea being that if the flowers were all dying, you knew the beer wasn't quite as fresh, because that had been for a few days. Africa, they've got records of them doing this outside huts in Africa, and putting garlands and flowers and things on this big stick to let them know there was the beers that they brew, or that the fermented drinks they brew. So it's quite a cool thing that this was just all happening, and yet with no one talking to each other and sharing this.
It's a good indication of the passing of time, but it wouldn't have been the first one I thought of. So for it to be so widespread,
how did this all connect?
Did that work?
Yeah, it's very cool. So it must have came from somewhere, but it's just that idea of, again, talking about the women and the home and the simplicity of, they're just doing this daily task. They can't have fancy jobs and education and stuff. A broomstick and a household thing outside the door.
Yes.
And we'll come back to the broomstick.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, but one of the other things they did was some of the kind of the more adventurous women maybe had a wee bit more beer to sell and were trying to make a real effort out kind of the rural villages and what have you. They would go out into the marketplaces, and to try and make sure that they were seen and people knew, they would wear like tall hats or pointed headdresses, so they would stand out and they could be seen easily. And these were, they called them tipplers or hawkers. They were selling their wares in the market, selling their beers. So again, it was all these things that women did, and it was just a way of bringing an income in, something they could do that was within the law and it wasn't frowned upon, because they could do it in the house, because back then it wasn't a good thing for women to be going out into the workplace. It was frowned upon, out doing things they shouldn't. They should be in the house looking after the family and what have you. So so it was quite cool, all kind of that kind of stuff. It took a bit of a downturn again, same as before, talking about commercialisation, because I think about the 14th century, I think it was, the Black Plague hit.
Right.
And a lot of people, a lot of the workforce were lost to the plague. So suddenly workers were really sought after, which meant the wages went up, because, these people had skills that were needed. And of course, like I said before, back then, workers were paid partly in beer. Some of them were getting maybe a gallon of beer a day as part of their pay. And that's, if you know about saison beers, you'll know about that, because saison beers were the farmhouse beers that were brewed specifically to pay the farmhands. And every farm had their own recipe, their own style, made with whatever was to hand. So, this kind of thing was what was going on. But suddenly you had these influx of workers coming in, the towns, the cities, getting bigger, and they're having to create more beer and places for them to have the beer, recreational places. So that's when the ale house came about, the taverns.
Right.
And this was the big downturn both of the reputation of the women brewing, but also of women being the brewers. Because you'll have seen it yourself, you've seen Dickensian at Christmas, or you've seen other sort of bits of pieces on TV, plays, books. When you think of the alehouse, you think of the alewife, who was always, shall we say, slightly dubious of her morals.
Yes.
Not much on, quite accommodating of her customers.
Yes, yes.
So this is how things have changed from this genuine woman in the home feeding her family. And some historians liken that with the Virgin Mary. You know, it's the woman providing sustenance, the Virgin Mary feeding the baby. You know.
Yeah.
Some historians liken that to, and this sudden change to, she was seen as this woman of low morals, and then from there it became not only is she a woman of low morals, she's shortchanging her customers.
Oh, right.
She's giving them short measures, she's using less than fresh ingredients, and this stuff started happening where these stone carvings and paintings started appearing in churches and things throughout the towns of alewives holding their short measures that they've shortened, you know, they've ripped their customers off, riding on the backs of demons, going to hell naked and things like this.
Right.
And it's just like all of a sudden this big change in the perception of these women who were brewing. Quite coincidentally, of course, obviously had nothing to do with it, that at the same time suddenly beer was commercialising, there was profits to be made. The laws changed and suddenly the women weren't allowed to, the women of that time couldn't hold a licence to have their own tavern, only the husband could have the licence, even though the women were brewing the beer. So this whole thing came about where you couldn't trust the alewives, you know, they were ripping people off, so suddenly the men took over the brewing as well, and gradually this is how we changed to the Beer Day Brew Club we have today, where the men are doing all the brewing, because it was taken out of the women's hands slowly over time once there was a profit to be made. And I'm saying about these carvings and things that appear, it's not just that, there's literature and all sorts, there's famous brewsters in literature throughout history, always been associated with the devil and, you know, doing no good and sinning and being loose women and stuff. You know, it's a real dunt to their reputation, to the point where, you know, you wouldn't go to a woman for beer, you would go to your proper tavern with someone you trust. And so it was a real change from going back to ancient Sumeria where these women were revered.
Of course.
That was a big downturn. But I was saying, if you start kind of thinking of pieces I was mentioning about the ale staff going outside, which was basically a broom, and the women wearing the tall hats or pointy headdresses. You might have had a cat to stop the mice eating their grain. Right. When they were brewing, you know, back then they didn't have electric brew systems. You know, it would have been a big metal pot on the fire. A cauldron. A big cauldron-like pot on the fire, yeah. And then they stopped the boil happening and all the magic happens. You know, suddenly this, out of nowhere, when no one touching it, starts frothing and bubbling and moving on its own. You see where I'm going with this?
Yes,
and the reputation of these women who brewed. Suddenly it became very, very easily that if you wanted rid of someone, you accused them of witchcraft. And very few women ever escaped an accusation of witchcraft with their lives. Right. So it was a very easy way if you had someone who had a brewing patch to take their patch, because you got rid of them and you accused them of being a witch. Convenient. Yeah, so that's kind of where everything started to change. And one of the things I was thinking about this when I was saying I was going to speak to you was, a lot of the times we look at things, and one of the things that got me was in 2013, the first time ever a woman was voted Home Brewer of the Year in the American Home Brew Association, which is enormous. You know, it's so many different competitions coming together, all the different clubs. It's a big deal. And this woman called Annie Johnson was voted Home Brewer of the Year. Good for her. Good for her. I remember seeing it and being so excited, because you think how many women do you know who home brew? Never mind how many do you know that get the same respect as the guys get. And this woman's just right. And not only did she go in there and steal it, she stole it with an American light lager. An American probably one of the hardest things to brew, because there's nothing to hide any of your flaws. It has to be perfect. And this woman stormed in and then just took this award, and it was, I was like, how cool is that? And I thought, does that mean things are changing? I thought, actually no, things have already changed, but in the opposite direction. Right. This is how it started out. And we now go through and it's all changed. We've got a lot of work ahead of us if we want to. Well, I don't know, do we? Because if you think about it, we met at that Women in Brewing event in Stewart's, and there were all these women in different parts of the industry there, and what was quite prevalent that night were how many of them were saying, well, no, I know loads of other women in the brewing industry. okay, it's not 50-50 yet.
No.
But there are plenty of really successful, amazing women in the craft brewing movement.
Yeah.
So there has been that little change. It's not necessarily the standard big old-fashioned breweries anymore, but the craft breweries, there are plenty of women in there. Quite a lot of whom have come out of Heriot here in Edinburgh.
Good.
So that's a good, well done to them.
Yes,
we like that.
Good. We like
quite a lot of those women are now going on to have fantastic breweries and get great jobs in the breweries. Mm-hmm. And there's a society in America called Pink Boots,
right,
named after the woman that was one of the early brewers, and she got a lot of stick and she found it quite difficult, and she used to wear pink wellies,
right,
because if you're in a big brewery it's really quite messy, you wear your wellies, and the society's named after her in pink wellies, and the whole point of it is to try and help and support women in brewing, help them to do proper training and learning things, and to keep them going on as brewers and get better as they go, and help them in the industry and learn about business and all that kind of thing.
Support network.
So it is there. It's maybe some of us are just, maybe a bit old and cynical and just remember the old Tennent's cans a bit too much.
Yes.
And we're not seeing the changes that are happening around us. Yes. Listen, my dad's not a beer drinker, he never was, but I remember him having those Tennent's cans.
Oh, did he know?
Yeah. He's embarrassed when I bring things like that up now. But
so he should be.
But yeah, so there has been this change over history, but maybe it's starting to balance out again. We're about blooming time.
Well, it is. I mean, there's absolutely nothing apart from tradition that would make...
No, absolutely not at all.
...anybody better at it than the other person, apart from context. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did as well, I was looking at that, I thought was quite amusing, was I thought, how cool is it in Cassie? But do you know how many different goddesses of beer there were? There were loads. I think I originally had about 4 sheets of paper. You've got, there's Akla, who was, she was one of the female virgins chosen by the Incan sun god to keep the sacred fire burning, and in her spare time she brewed the beer.
All right.
There was Ibina, who was an ancient Celtic kind of British goddess of barley. She's one of the earliest known ones, actually. She was also called Albion.
Mm-hmm.
Which became the name of the kind of Celtic Britain lands.
Yes.
And also New Albion Brewing is named after her.
All right.
There was Ashnan, who was Mesopotamian. I can't say that. Mesopotamian. Again, she was a goddess of drunkenness, wine and grain, so we quite liked her.
Yes.
There's Cerethin, who was the Irish and Welsh goddess of barley and brewing, who was also known for the inspiration of the witch's cauldron for her brewing.
Of course.
Who else have we got? We've got Lithuanian goddesses. We've got, who else is good? Mali. We've got a Zulu beer goddess. A Zulu now. I won't be able to say this. Mbaba Mwana Waresa. She's a Zulu goddess of fertility, the rainbow, agriculture, rain, and beer. And she was believed to have invented beer and made the first beer for people. And she also creates rainbows as a signal that it's time to start drinking.
Excellent.
I'm liking her. I think we need a new brewery with her name on it.
Might be a bit of a mouthful, but yes.
Yeah, we've also got an Irish goddess who was the Queen of Connacht, who was a goddess of intoxication and beer.
Right.
And we've got, I mentioned earlier the Vikings in Asgard, which basically, to the Vikings, heaven is a big ale house where you drink beer with the gods. They had the god, now I won't get it right, I think it's Aegir, and he was the brewer to the gods with his 9 daughters who were his assistant brewers.
Really?
So there's loads of this in history, it's just kind of been forgotten about it.
Well, I'm glad that we've got records of these things, and we can at least point at them and go, look, it just needs to be different.
Read this, I'm honest, I'm not making it up. Okay, you can't read this big stone tablet, but trust me about what it says. Yeah, but there's quite a few academics now that are researching women in history of brewing and the ale and what have you. There's quite a few British ones as well. So it's all out there for anyone that's interested. Go mad, go look it up and get excited.
Yeah, find out some more.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Go and look up Annie Johnson and see what she's doing, because she's doing so much more now, way more awards.
All right.
She's also now a judge at lots of the beer competitions. She's a kind of professional face of brewing for lots of commercial companies and things now. All because she was a really, really good home brewer. So yeah, so there's space for us all out there.
Yes.
Plenty of us taking medals. So.
Brilliant. Yeah. I had a conversation with a female brewer from Traquair, she's had this theory that women are physiologically different and taste things differently from men.
I've heard that before.
So the theory being that the females would maybe be in charge of foraging, finding plants, maybe the men more hunting and there's the bigger muscle.
Get the mastodon to go with the beer.
Yes, that kind of thing. But that women would need to be able to distinguish bitter tastes and be more sensitive to bitter tastes as in their role as avoiding poisons.
Well, they do say that that's where our aversion to bitter comes from. It's because poisons are bitter.
Yes, and
which means those of us who like a good IPA are screwed, basically.
Yes, you wouldn't do very well.
No.
But that was their theory that women like fruitier beers, and I have seen that, and
I have heard that before. That they think women possibly have a slightly more delicate palate and can taste the more delicate flavours and things, so possibly get more out of a beer than a man would.
That should make us better judges.
They were saying that also means that these breweries now, we won't name names, but the beers they make for women that have special fruit flavours and are lighter in flavour and alcohol and calories, totally flies on the head of that, because women are going, no, we want the big tasting beers, the proper ones, we want the porters, the stouts,
yes.
Which when you think about it, when women drink the beer, it's not necessarily a lager they go for. It tends to be porters, stouts, heavier beers, red beers.
Yes, because we're not sitting thinking 13 of them while we're watching the football.
No, exactly, we're sitting enjoying it.
For the most part, obviously some of us
do occasionally, and then regret it the next morning. But so there may be something in there. And we do have a lot of very successful beer sommeliers now.
We do, yes.
So
I've read about a few females that are doing exceptionally good work there, writing books and everything.
Yep,
so.
a lot of success there. So so
the future's rosy for us.
It is indeed. The future is possibly amber through a glass with condensation on it.
Nails it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was amazing. Cheers.